The Duke of Kent was the Greek god of the Windsor dynasty. He was the glittering war hero who married the elegant Princess Marina, the picture of royal perfection during Britain's darkest hour. But behind the heavy velvet curtains of Buckingham Palace, George was living a perilous duality. While his brother, King George VI, stood for grim sobriety, George was a fluid hedonist exploring the forbidden shadows with figures like playwright Noël Coward. He was a recovering addict, haunted by his toxic romance with Kiki Preston, the notorious girl with the silver syringe. He was a soul who found his true family in the smoky jazz cellars of Soho rather than the cold halls of Windsor. And when he finally plunged from the sky on a misty Scottish hillside in 1942, the crash didn't just kill a prince, it threatened to expose secrets that could shatter the monarchy forever. It was 1902, the twilight of the Victorian era. The British Empire covered a quarter of the globe, painted pink on maps hanging in classrooms from London to Bombay. It was a world of absolute certainty, of rigid hierarchies, where everyone knew their place and the king was God's chosen representative on earth. George was born the fourth son of the future king George V and Queen Mary. In the cold calculations of royal succession, he was the reserve of the reserve of the reserve. He was never destined to rule. He was born to be a supporting actor in the grand drama of the monarchy. An ornament moved around the stage as the task demanded. But it seems fate had not read that script. From his earliest days in the royal nurseries of Sandringham and York Cottage, it was clear that Prince George was different. While his brothers, David, Bertie, and Henry, grew into the molds prepared for them, George possessed a spirit that seemed almost alien to the House of Windsor. He was physically beautiful in a way that was disarming, even as a child. He had long eyelashes, piercing blue eyes, and a sensitivity that vibrated just below the surface. He was musical, artistic, and possessed a natural fluid charm that could disarm anyone. But in the household of George V, charm was not a currency of value. Obedience was. George V was a man of the 19th century, a naval officer who ran his family like a battleship. He was obsessed with punctuality, terrified of change, and deeply suspicious of intellect or artistic tendencies. He was a father who believed that affection was a dangerous indulgence. He famously declared to a courtier, "My father was frightened of his mother. I was frightened of my father, and I am damned well going to see to it that my children are frightened of me." And they were. The king's study, known as the library, was a place of terror for the young princes. The summons to the library meant one thing: a dressing down. The king's voice, a quarter-deck roar, would boom through the heavy oak doors, berating his sons for the slightest infraction. A messy kilt, a hands-in-pocket stance, a stuttered answer. For a sensitive child like George, this environment was psychological torture. He learned to make himself small, to hide his true nature, to wear a mask of compliance. But where his brother Bertie developed a debilitating stammer and nervous knocks, George developed something else, a capacity for deception. He learned that to survive, he had to live two lives, one for his father, the dutiful, silent cadet, and one for himself, a secret internal world where he could dream of escape. His mother, Queen Mary, was no refuge. Though she loved her children in her own way, she was icy, distant, and utterly beholden to the king's will. She was a woman who would not let a single hair be out of place even if the palace was burning down. There were no hugs, no warm laps to crawl into. There was only duty. The tragedy of George's childhood was not just the lack of love, it was the active suppression of his talents. He showed a remarkable aptitude for the piano. He could hear a piece of music once and play it back perfectly. He had an eye for color, for fashion, for the aesthetic beauty of the world. In a different family, he might have been encouraged to become an artist, a musician, a patron of the theater. In the House of Windsor, these were seen as effeminate traits, dangerous weaknesses that needed to be stamped out. And the Windsors had a brutal method for stamping out weakness: the Royal Navy. At the age of 13, just as World War I was beginning to tear Europe apart, George was sent away to the Royal Naval College at Osborne. It was a place of Spartan hardship. The dormitories were freezing, the food was inedible, and the discipline was sadistic. For George, it was a descent into hell. The other cadets, knowing he was a prince, oscillated between sycophancy and brutal bullying. But the true enemy was the sea itself. From the moment he stepped onto a ship, George suffered from chronic, debilitating seasickness. It wasn't just a mild nausea. It was a physical wretchedness that left him gray-faced, shaking, and unable to eat for days. Imagine the misery of it. A teenage boy, artistic and gentle, trapped in the iron belly of a warship, surrounded by the machinery of death, vomiting until his stomach was empty, and then being screamed at by officers to stand up and do his duty. He wrote letters home pleading, desperate letters, hinting at his unhappiness. "It is very rough today," he would write, a profound understatement for the agony he was in. But the response from the palace was always the same: stick it out. A prince does not complain. A prince does not get seasick. He endured this for years. Through the terrifying years of the Great War, while his brother David was visiting the trenches in France and becoming the idol of the common soldier, George was trapped in the lonely, heaving grayness of the North Sea. He served on the battleship HMS Iron Duke and later the HMS Nelson. He did his job. He scrubbed decks. He stood watch in the freezing spray. He learned the mechanics of gunnery. But inside, something was hardening. The sensitive boy was dying, and a cynical, resentful young man was taking his place. He began to look at the institution of the monarchy not with reverence, but with a cold, analytical detachment. He saw the absurdity of it. He saw how his father, the king, sat in his warm palace moving flags on a map while boys George's age were being turned into pink mist by artillery shells in Flanders. It was during these lonely nights at sea that the rebel began to form. George realized that he was essentially a prisoner. He had committed no crime, yet he was sentenced to a life he hated simply because of an accident of birth. This realization bred a deep, simmering anger. It also bred a hunger for sensation. After years of sensory deprivation, the gray sea, the gray ships, the gray uniforms, George craved color. He craved warmth. He craved intensity. When the war finally ended in 1918, the world broke open. The old empires had crumbled. The Romanovs were dead in a cellar in Ekaterinburg. The Hohenzollerns were in exile. But the Windsors had survived. They emerged from the wreckage of the war stronger than ever. But the world around them had changed fundamentally. The deferential, buttoned-up society of the Edwardian era was gone. In its place came a manic, desperate energy. The survivors of the trenches wanted to forget. They wanted to dance until they dropped. They wanted to drink until they couldn't remember the sound of the guns. George returned to London in the early 1920s, a man transformed. He was no longer the frightened boy in the library. He was 20 years old, tall, lean, and possessing a magnetism that was almost palpable. He had shed the awkwardness of adolescence and emerged as a creature of rare elegance. He moved with a dancer's grace. His clothes were tailored to perfection, breaking the stuffy norms of his father's generation with subtle flares of modernity. And he had an ally, His older brother Edward, the Prince of Wales, was the most famous bachelor in the world. Edward was charismatic, modern, and just as suffocated by their father as George was. The two brothers formed a pact. They would perform their duties during the day, the ribbon cuttings, the plaque unveilings, the endless handshaking, but the nights belonged to them. They moved out of the gloomy confines of Buckingham Palace and set up their own households at St. James's Palace. This was the breach in the wall. This was the escape hatch. London in the 1920s was a city of shadows and neon, a place where the aristocracy mingled with actors, jazz musicians, and gangsters. It was the era of the bright young things, a generation of wealthy, reckless socialites who treated life as a piece of performance art. They threw parties that were legendary for their excess. They organized treasure hunts that saw convoys of Bentleys and Bugattis roaring through the quiet streets of London at 3 a.m., chasing clues. They broke into swimming pools, they climbed statues, they lived as if there were no tomorrow. And George was their prince. If Edward was the figurehead of this movement, George was its dark heart. He was more intelligent than Edward, more artistic, and far more willing to push the boundaries of danger. He discovered that his royal title was a golden key that could unlock any door in London. He began to frequent the underground jazz clubs of Soho, places where the air was thick with smoke and syncopated rhythm. He loved the music. It was chaotic, emotional, and free, everything his life was not. He would sit at the piano, his fingers flying over the keys, lost in the improvisation, and for a moment he wasn't the Duke of Kent. He was just a man with a soul on fire. But the jazz clubs offered more than just music. They offered an entry into a world of forbidden desires. It was here, in the dimly lit corners of the Roaring Twenties, that George began to explore the duality of his own nature. He realized that his attraction was not limited to the debutantes his mother paraded before him. He found himself drawn to the camaraderie of men, not just as brothers in arms, but as lovers. In the 1920s, England, love between men was illegal. It was a crime, punishable by imprisonment and total social ostracization. For Prince of the Blood, it was unthinkable. It was a vulnerability that could bring down the entire dynasty. Yet George did not retreat. Driven by that reckless streak that had been forged in the misery of his youth, he stepped closer to the edge. He began to live a triple life. By day, the naval officer. By early evening, the charming prince at the society ball. And by late night, a traveler in the hedonistic underground of London. He met playwrights, artists, and bohemians who cared nothing for his title and everything for his wit and beauty. He befriended Noël Coward, the sharp-tongued genius of the theater, a man who lived his own life in open defiance of societal norms. Their friendship was electric, fueled by a shared sense of being outsiders looking in at a ridiculous world. But this freedom came with a price. George was filling the void inside him, but the void was deep. The adrenaline of the parties, the thrill of the illicit affairs, the constant movement. It was all a way to run from the depression that dogged him, the black dog that he had inherited from his ancestors. He was looking for something to numb the pain, something stronger than champagne, something that could silence the voice of his father in his head. And in the glittering, dangerous circles of the bright young things, he found it, or rather, she found him. Her name was Kiki Preston. She was an American, a cousin of the Vanderbilts, with a smile that could stop traffic and eyes that held a terrifying emptiness. She was wilder than any of them. She was fearless. And in her purse she carried a silver syringe. She was a user of morphine and cocaine, drugs that were fashionable but deadly. When she looked at Prince George, she didn't see a royal icon. She saw a fellow lost soul. She saw a man in pain and she offered him a cure. The meeting of Prince George and Kiki Preston was not a romance. It was a collision. It was the moment the teetering structure of George's life finally began to tip. He was young, he was vulnerable, and he was desperate for a release from the crushing weight of his own existence. He took what she offered, and in that moment the royal rebel crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. The golden cage was about to become a prison of a very different kind. The descent was not immediate. It never is. At first, the introduction of morphine and cocaine into Prince George's life felt less like a fall and more like an ascension. For a young man whose entire existence had been defined by the crushing weight of anxiety, by the constant thrumming fear of his father's judgment, and by the suffocating corset of royal protocol, the drugs were not an escape. They were a revelation. Kiki Preston, with her silver syringe and her careless American laugh, became the high priestess of this new religion. In her Knightsbridge apartment, far removed from the drafty corridors of Buckingham Palace, George found a sanctuary where the rules of the House of Windsor did not apply. The prick of the needle was a small price to pay for the sudden, overwhelming silence that would descend upon his mind. The stuttering self-doubt vanished. The nagging worry about his duties, his appearance, his difference, evaporated into a warm, golden haze. Under the influence, George was no longer the spare heir, the disappointment, the naval failure. He was witty, he was invincible, he was free. They became inseparable, a striking pair moving through the smoky haze of London's nightlife. To the uninitiated, they were simply two beautiful young aristocrats enjoying the roaring 20s. But those who looked closely saw the telltale signs. The pinned pupils, the erratic bursts of manic energy followed by profound lethargy, the glassy sheen over George's famous blue eyes. They were chemically bound to one another. Kiki, wealthy and damaged, possessed a terrifying power over the prince. She was the gatekeeper to his peace of mind. George, in turn, gave her access to the highest echelons of British society, a thrill that fed her own voracious appetite for chaos. But the drugs unlocked more than just relaxation. They dissolved inhibition. And for Prince George, whose suppressed desires were a powder keg waiting for a spark, this was catastrophic. The morphine stripped away the fear that had kept his true nature in check. The double life he had been flirting with suddenly became a reckless, open pursuit. He began to venture into the darker, more dangerous corners of the capital. He was no longer content with the coded, polite liaisons of the upper classes, the knowing glances at the opera, the discreet dinners. George wanted the raw authenticity of the underground. He frequented illegal clubs in Soho and the East End, places where sailors, rough trade, and bohemian artists mingled in a haze of tobacco and forbidden pleasure. It was a world of immense danger. At any moment, a police raid could have occurred. Imagine the headline, "King's Son Arrested in Vice Den." It would have shattered the monarchy. The Romanovs had fallen for less. Yet George moved through this underworld with a terrifying sense of invulnerability. He believed, perhaps induced by the narcotics, that his royal status was a shield that could not be pierced. He began a series of intense, volatile relationships with men. The most significant and the most dangerous was his bond with Noël Coward. The playwright was everything George wished he could be: openly flamboyant, brilliantly talented, and utterly self-possessed. Coward did not bow and scrape. He treated George as an equal, mocking the pomp of royalty with a biting wit that George found intoxicating. They were seen together constantly. They paraded through the West End, a provocative duo, the most famous writer and the most beautiful prince. Rumors began to swirl, whispering through the drawing rooms of Mayfair and eventually seeping under the doors of the palace. There were stories of George being stopped by the police while dressed in women's clothing during a wild party, only to be released into the night the moment the constables realized who they were manhandling. Whether true or apocryphal, these stories illuminate the edge on which George was dancing. He was testing the boundaries of reality, daring the world to stop him. But the human body, even a royal one, has limits. By the late 1920s, the chemical vacation was turning into a prison sentence. The cocaine, used to wake him up for morning engagements, made him jittery and paranoid. The morphine, used to bring him down at night, left him gray-skinned and emaciated. The handsome Greek god was beginning to look like a ghost. His hands shook so violently that he could barely hold a teacup during official functions with the Lord Mayor or visiting dignitaries. He would drift off in the middle of conversations, his eyes rolling back, leaving courtiers scrambling to cover the awkward silence. King George V, isolated in his rigid morality, was baffled. He saw his son's deterioration but lacked the vocabulary to understand it. To the king, George was simply nervous, weak, or dissolute. He railed against him, shouting in the library, which only sent George fleeing back to Kiki and the needle for comfort. The cycle was spiraling downward, faster and faster. It was a blackmail attempt that finally rang the alarm bell loud enough to shatter the glass. Letters, intimate, indiscreet letters George had written to a male lover, fell into the wrong hands. A large sum of money was demanded. The terrifying reality of his situation crashed down on George. He was not just ruining himself, he was compromising the crown. In his drug-addled panic, he had no one to turn to. He couldn't go to his father. The king would likely have an apoplectic fit. He couldn't go to the police. He went to David. The relationship between the Prince of Wales and Prince George is the emotional anchor of this tragedy. David is often remembered by history as the selfish king who abandoned his country for Mrs. Simpson. But in the story of Prince George, David was a savior. He was the only one who understood the crushing pressure of their lives. When he saw the state of his younger brother, a shivering, weeping wreck, terrified of exposure, addicted to heroin and cocaine, David did not judge, he acted. The Prince of Wales, using his immense influence and personal funds, moved swiftly to kill the blackmail scandal. The letters were retrieved and burned, but David knew that paying off a blackmailer was a temporary fix. The root of the rot was Kiki Preston. The confrontation that followed was brutal. David, usually known for his charm and lack of seriousness, displayed a ruthless streak that stunned everyone. He cornered George and forced the truth into the light. He saw the track marks. He saw the vacancy in his brother's eyes. He realized that George was dying. David then turned his sights on Kiki Preston. We do not know the exact words exchanged, but the outcome was decisive. The Prince of Wales, utilizing the shadowy machinery of the British establishment, made it clear to the girl with the silver syringe that her time in England was over. She was effectively banished, driven out of George's life by the sheer force of the monarchy protecting its own. It was a heartless act to save a life, cutting out the cancer to save the patient. But removing Kiki was the easy part. Removing the addiction from George's blood was a journey through hell. David took George away. He spirited him off to a secluded country house, far from the dealers of London and the prying eyes of the press. There were no rehab clinics for royalty in the 1920s. There was only a locked room, a bed, and the iron will of a brother. What followed was a weeks-long nightmare of withdrawal. George was forced to go cold turkey. It is a testament to the horror of addiction that the physical pain of leaving the drug is often worse than the pain that drove the user to it in the first place. For days, the house echoed with the sounds of George's agony. He screamed, he vomited, he convulsed, he hallucinated demons coming out of the wallpaper. He begged, wept, and pleaded for just one hit, one small dose to stop the insects crawling under his skin. And through it all, David sat by the bed. He wiped the sweat from his brother's forehead. He held him down when the convulsions took him. He listened to the incoherent confessions of shame and self-hatred that poured out of George's mouth. In that room, stripped of titles and uniforms, they were just two frightened men fighting a demon. This experience forged a bond between them that was unbreakable. It explains why, years later, when David was the one being ostracized for his love of Wallace Simpson, George was the only brother who refused to turn his back on him. They had seen each other at their absolute worst. When George finally emerged from that country house, he was a shell. He was frail, pale, and trembling, but his eyes were clear. He had survived. He had stared into the abyss of total self-destruction and had been pulled back by the hand of his brother. He returned to London, but it was a different city now. The neon lights of the Jazz Age no longer looked inviting. They looked like warning fires. He had to rebuild a life from the ashes. He was sober, but he was raw. The drugs had been his armor against the world, and now he was walking into battle naked. He had to face his father, the court, and his own reflection without the chemical buffer. It was a fragile convalescence. The palace spun a narrative of digestive trouble or nervous exhaustion to explain his absence. The public never knew that their golden prince had spent a summer screaming in a locked room, but the insiders knew. The courtiers looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Was he cured, or was he a ticking time bomb waiting to go off again? George threw himself into the only thing he had left, the arts. If he couldn't live the bohemian life, he would patronize it. He began to collect paintings with a discerning eye. He surrounded himself with beauty that didn't require a needle to appreciate, but the loneliness was profound. Kiki was gone. His lovers were kept at a terrified distance. He was clean, but he was incredibly solitary. The early 1930s were a gray limbo for George. He was a survivor, yes, but what was he surviving for? The dynastic pressure began to mount again. The king, seeing his son sober, decided that the problem was solved and returned to his favorite obsession, marriage. George must settle down, was the refrain. A wife will steady him. George looked at the prospect of marriage with a mixture of dread and resignation. How could he, a man who had lived in the darkest valleys of human experience, who desired men, who had been a junkie, play the role of the Victorian husband? It seemed like a farce. He felt he was too damaged for any respectable princess. Who would want a man with his history, his scars, his secrets? But destiny, as it often does in the lives of the Windsors, arrived in a form he didn't expect. She didn't come from the English aristocracy, with their horsey laughs and dull conversations. She came from the tragic romantic ruins of the Greek monarchy. In 1933, at a dinner party in London, George found himself seated across from his second cousin, Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. She was not like the others. She had tasted bitterness too, her family exiled, her wealth lost, living as a refugee royal in Paris. She had a sophistication, a world weariness, and a sharp artistic intelligence that matched his own. When she looked at him, she didn't see the drug addict or the forbidden liaisons. She saw the man. And for the first time since the withdrawal, George felt a spark, not the dangerous, incinerating fire of Kiki Preston, but something warmer, something steady. He didn't know it yet, but he was looking at the woman who would become the other half of his soul, the woman who would help him construct the final, most convincing mask of his life, the golden couple. But before the wedding bells could ring, George had to make a choice. He had to decide if he could truly bury the rebel inside him, or if he was simply building a more elaborate cage. And across the channel in the beer halls of Munich, a different kind of darkness was rising, one that would eventually demand more from George than just his sobriety. It would demand his life. The year 1934 marked the turning of a page, not just for Prince George, but for the entire British monarchy. The darkness of the reformatory country house and the sweat-soaked sheets of withdrawal were pushed into the background, overlaid by the blinding white light of a royal romance that the public was desperate to consume. Britain was weary. The Great Depression had gnawed at the bones of the industrial North. Fascism was marching in goose step across the continent, and the people needed a fairy tale. They needed a distraction from the gray reality of the dole queues and the gathering storm clouds. They found it in the union of Prince George and Princess Marina, of Greece and Denmark. If George was the reluctant, damaged prince, Marina was the survivor of a tragedy. Her family had been expelled from Greece during the violent upheavals of the 1920s. She had lived the life of a royal refugee, wandering between the grand hotels of Paris and the country houses of relatives, possessing a grand title but very little money. This precarious existence had forged her into a woman of steel and style. She was not the sheltered, rosy-cheeked English rose that the palace usually selected for its sons. She was sharp, she was cosmopolitan, and she possessed a chic, continental elegance that made the dowdy Windsors look positively medieval. She smoked, she wore trousers, and she had a gaze that suggested she had seen the world and found it amusing. When the engagement was announced in August 1934, the hysteria was immediate. George now created the Duke of Kent, and his dazzling fiancée became the first true celebrity royals of the modern age. Their wedding at Westminster Abbey in November was a spectacle of imperial magnitude. It was the first royal wedding to be broadcast on the wireless, carrying the solemn vows into millions of living rooms across the empire. For a few hours, the world stopped. The streets of London were 10 deep with cheering crowds, waving Union Jacks, desperate to catch a glimpse of the Greek goddess and her handsome prince. Inside the abbey, as the organ swelled and the archbishops intoned the ancient liturgy, George stood at the altar in his naval uniform. He looked every inch the hero, but one can only imagine the thoughts racing through his mind as he waited for his bride. He was 31 years old. He had lived 1,000 lives in the shadows. He had been a junkie, a lover of men, a rebel, and a disappointment. Now, he was the hope of the dynasty. The weight of expectation was crushing. He was promising to be faithful, to be steady, to be the pillar of the establishment he had once despised. But the marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Kent was far more complex and far more interesting than the fairy tale the BBC narrated to the masses. It was not a cure for George's nature, it was a partnership. They settled into number 3 Belgrave Square in London and a country estate called Coombe. To the outside world, they were the picture of domestic perfection. They were beautiful, they were stylish, and they quickly produced children. Prince Edward, Princess Alexandra, and later Prince Michael. They were the most fashionable couple in Europe. Marina became a style icon, her hats and gowns copied by women from Mayfair to Manchester. George, with his artistic eye, curated their homes with impeccable taste, filling them with modern art and antiques, creating a salon atmosphere that attracted the intelligentsia of London. Yet behind the heavy curtains of Belgrave Square, the agreement was in play. George loved Marina. Their letters reveal a genuine, deep affection and a shared sense of humor. She was his anchor, the one person who could handle his moods and his neuroticism without flinching. But she could not, change his fundamental biology. George remained a man who desired men. In the rigid moral code of the 1930s, this should have destroyed the marriage. In any other household, it might have led to divorce or scandal. But George and Marina were royals, and they were European royals at that. They understood that duty came first, and that happiness was a complex negotiation. There is strong evidence to suggest that Marina knew of George's inclinations and accepted them, provided they remained discreet. It was a sophisticated, if melancholy, arrangement. George continued to live his double life, but now he had a co-conspirator to help him guard the gates. He was still seen in the company of Noël Coward. He still had his private secretaries and male companions who lingered a little too long at the country house. But the reckless, self-destructive edge of the 1920s was gone. He was no longer trying to blow up his life. He was trying to manage it. He was walking a tightrope, balancing his duty as a husband and father with the undeniable truth of his own desires. The strain was always there, a low-level hum of anxiety that never quite went away. He was terrified of boredom, terrified of the black dog of depression returning, and he filled his days with frantic activity to keep the silence at bay. Then, in 1936, the ground beneath him collapsed again. King George V died in January. The old tyrant, the man who had terrified his children into submission, was gone. For a brief moment, there was a sense of liberation. George's beloved brother, David, ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. It seemed like the dawn of a new modern era. David was the golden boy, the reformer, the man who would drag the monarchy into the 20th century. George, as his closest brother and confidant, expected to be his right-hand man. But David was not the savior they hoped for. He was a man consumed by an obsession. The crisis of the abdication is usually told through the lens of Edward and Wallace Simpson, or through the eyes of the stammering Bertie. But for the Duke of Kent, the abdication was a personal catastrophe. It was a betrayal of the highest order. David had been George's protector. He was the one who had saved him from Kiki Preston, who had wiped his brow during withdrawal, who had burned the blackmail letters. George worshipped him, and now he watched in horror as David threw it all away. George, perhaps better than anyone, understood the suffocating weight of the crown. He knew why David wanted to escape, but George had stayed. George had swallowed his own desires, married the appropriate princess, and played the game. He had sacrificed his freedom for the family. When it became clear that David was going to abdicate to marry the twice-divorced American, Mrs. Simpson, George was devastated. There is a heartbreaking account of a meeting between the brothers at the Fort Belvedere during the final agonizing days of the crisis. George paced the room, shouting at the king, "You are mad, you are mad." It wasn't just anger at the constitutional crisis. It was the anguish of a brother who felt abandoned. If the golden boy could quit, what did that say about George's own sacrifices? Why had George forced himself into a mold if the mold could simply be broken? When David signed the instrument of abdication and sailed into exile, he left a shattered family behind. The stammering, unprepared Bertie became King George VI, and the Duke of Kent, the unstable, recovered addict, suddenly found himself as a crucial pillar of a trembling institution. He had to step up. The monarchy was teetering on the brink of irrelevance or collapse. They needed every able-bodied royal to work, to show the flag, to prove to the British people that the Windsors were still worth keeping. George threw himself into his work with a ferocity that surprised everyone. He became the first member of the royal family to cross the line from figurehead to worker. He took a role in the civil service, working as a factory inspector for the Home Office. This was unprecedented. He didn't just cut ribbons, he put on overalls. He visited coal mines in Wales and steel mills in Sheffield. He crawled into the cramping darkness of the pits, talking to men with coal dust in their lungs. For the first time in his life, George found a connection with the common man that wasn't based on deference. In the grim industrial towns, he saw a different kind of suffering: poverty, disease, hopelessness. It resonated with the pain he carried inside himself. He became a passionate advocate for social reform. His reports back to the government filled with genuine outrage at the conditions he witnessed. The playboy prince was becoming a man of substance. He was also deeply involved in the world of intelligence. As the 1930s drew to a close and the shadow of Adolf Hitler lengthened across Europe, George's European connections became a double-edged sword. Through his mother and his wife, he was related to almost every royal house in Europe, many of which were now under the sway of Nazi Germany. He spoke fluent German and French. He knew these people. He had dined with them. There is a murky, controversial chapter here. In the years leading up to the war, George, like many in the British aristocracy, was accused of being sympathetic to the German cause. He had visited Germany. He had met with senior Nazi officials. To modernize, this looks like damnation, but we must understand the context. George, having seen the ruin of the First World War, was a desperate pacifist. He believed, perhaps naively, that personal diplomacy could prevent another slaughter. He thought that because he was a prince, he could talk to other leaders as equals and reason with them. He was wrong. The world of 1939 was not the world of 1914. It was not governed by the gentlemanly codes of kings and emperors. It was governed by ideologies that wanted to burn the old world down. When war was declared on September 3rd, 1939, George's life of fragile stability was shattered once again. The factory inspector was put back into uniform. He stripped off his civil servant suit and donned the blue of the Royal Air Force. He was made a group captain and later an air commodore. But this was not the reluctant midshipman of 1916 vomiting into a bucket. This was a man who had found a new obsession: flight. George loved flying. Up in the air, thousands of feet above the earth, he found the only true peace he had ever known. No protocols, no courtiers, no whispering about his indiscretions, no past. Just the roar of the engines and the endless blue. He was a capable pilot, though his reckless streak never quite left him. He was known to fly low, to take risks, to push the aircraft to its limits. It was as if he was taunting death, daring it to catch him. As the Battle of Britain raged overhead in 1940, George became a roving morale booster. He visited bombed-out cities, walking through the rubble of Coventry and the East End while the smoke was still rising. The people loved him. He didn't have the awkward stiffness of the king. He was handsome, dashing in his RAF uniform, and he had a way of speaking to a grieving widow or a bombed-out shopkeeper that made them feel seen. He was the people's prince long before the term was invented. But while he was playing the role of the hero in public, the private shadows were lengthening. The war had cut him off from the continental support network of his wife's family. Marina was worried for her relatives in occupied Greece. George was worried for his brother, the Duke of Windsor, who was behaving erratically in exile, flirting with the Nazis in a way that terrified the British government. George found himself in a unique and dangerous position. He was the brother of the king, the brother of the exiled former king, and a man with deep, perhaps compromising knowledge of the diplomatic back channels of Europe. He was a repository of secrets. And in a war where information was as lethal as a bullet, secrets were a dangerous currency. By 1942, the strain was visible on his face. Photographs from this period show a man who looks older than his 39 years. The lines around his eyes were deep. The smile was tighter. He was exhausted. He was flying constantly, crisscrossing the country, living out of a suitcase. He was also allegedly engaged in covert missions. There are whispers, never proven but persistent, that George was being used by British intelligence as a high-level courier. Who better to move sensitive documents or messages than the king's own brother? Who would dare search the Duke of Kent? It was in this atmosphere of high tension, exhaustion, and subterfuge that the calendar turned to August 1942. The summer was waning, the war was at a stalemate, and Prince George, the Duke of Kent, received orders for a tour of inspection in Iceland. It was a standard mission on paper, but nothing about George's life had ever been standard. He spent the days before the flight at Balmoral with the king and queen. It was a family gathering, a rare moment of peace in the Highlands. King George VI later recalled that his brother was in good spirits, but there was a wistfulness about him. They walked the heather-covered hills, the two survivors of their father's tyranny, the two men left holding the fortress of the monarchy. They didn't know it was the last time they would ever speak. On August 24th, George said goodbye to Marina. She was at Coombe, pregnant with their third child, Prince Michael. He kissed her, kissed his children, and climbed into the car that would take him north to Scotland, to the flying boat base at Invergordon. He was driving away from the life he had so painfully constructed, the wife who understood him, the children who gave him purpose, the work that gave him dignity. He was driving toward the mist, toward the sea, and toward a destiny that had been waiting for him since the moment he first rebelled against the world he was born into. The royal rebel was about to take his final flight. The afternoon of August 25, 1942, at the Royal Air Force Base in Invergordon, Scotland, was grey and sullen. The mist that clung to the Cromarty Firth was thick, a wet blanket that muffled sound and obscured the horizon. It was the kind of weather that grounded birds, let alone massive flying boats. Yet on the choppy water, the short Sunderland W4026, call sign DQM, bobbed impatiently, its 4 Pegasus engines coughing into life, spitting smoke into the damp air. Inside the fuselage, the mood was a strange cocktail of routine and suppressed anxiety. The crew of 14 was hand-picked, experienced men who had flown these treacherous northern routes dozens of times. They were the best of the best, selected specifically for this high-profile VIP transport. Their passenger, His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent, sat not in the plush comfort of a VIP cabin, for a Sunderland was a war machine, stripped of luxury, but up on the flight deck. George loved the flight deck. It was the only place where he felt truly in control. He was a qualified pilot, an air commodore who resented being treated like precious cargo. He wanted to see the instruments, to feel the vibration of the throttles, to read the map. Witnesses later recalled seeing him board the launch to the aircraft, looking grim but focused. He carried with him a briefcase, a battered leather attaché case that he refused to let out of his sight. It was handcuffed to his wrist. In the paranoia of wartime, this wasn't entirely unusual, but the way George guarded it suggested it contained more than just inspection schedules or clean socks. At 1:10 p.m., the massive flying boat began its takeoff run. It was a lumbering beast, struggling to break the suction of the water, spray hammering against the hull until, with a final shudder, it lifted into the gray sky. The plan was simple: fly northwest, follow the coastline, and then strike out across the open ocean to Iceland, a straight line over the water, safe, predictable. But almost immediately, something went wrong. Instead of turning out to sea, the Sunderland banked inland. It began to climb, but not fast enough. It was heading directly into the teeth of the Scottish Highlands, into a wall of solid cloud that hid the granite peaks of Caithness. Why? This question has echoed through history for 80 years. Was it a navigational error, a mechanical failure, or was it an order? Inside the cockpit, chaos must have descended instantly. The pilots, Flight Lieutenant Frank Goyen and Wing Commander Thomas Mosley, were seasoned aviators. They knew this terrain. They knew that flying a seaplane over mountains in zero visibility was suicide. Yet, they flew on. The drone of the engines echoed off the invisible hillsides, a terrifying sound to the crofters working the land below. They heard the plane roaring low, too low, the sound of a giant insect trapped in a jar. At roughly 1:30 p.m., the mist parted for a split second, revealing a horrifying reality. The jagged face of Eagle's Rock was directly ahead. There was no time to pull up, no time to scream. The Sunderland slammed into the hillside with the force of a meteorite. The fuel tanks, laden with thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation spirit for the long flight to Iceland, ruptured instantly. The explosion was cataclysmic. A fireball rolled up the misty slope, turning the heather to ash and the aluminum of the fuselage into molten rain. In that blinding flash, the Duke of Kent, the prince of the Jazz Age, the lover, the father, the rebel, ceased to exist. The silence that followed was heavier than the mist. The wind whipped the smoke away, revealing a scar of blackened earth and twisted metal. 15 men lay dead or dying on the hillside. But amidst the carnage, a miracle occurred. The tail section of the Sunderland had snapped off on impact and tumbled away from the inferno. Inside the rear turret, Flight Sergeant Andrew Jack, the tail gunner, was battered, burned, and thrown violently against the structure. But he was alive. He crawled out of the wreckage, dazed, his uniform scorched. He stumbled through the burning debris, calling out names, looking for his crewmates. He found only silence and the crackle of flames. He wandered down the hillside, a ghost emerging from hell, until he found a crofter's cottage. He collapsed at the door, his first words a delirious, repetitive mantra that would haunt the investigation. It wasn't the pilot's fault. It wasn't the pilot's fault. Back at the crash site, the local doctor and a search party arrived to a scene of devastation. They found the bodies scattered among the heather. The Duke of Kent was identified by the distinctive markings on his uniform and personal effects. The briefcase, the one he had guarded so jealously, was found nearby. It was open. What happened next is where history blurs into conjecture. Reports from the first responders, locals, not military men, mention seeing hundreds of banknotes fluttering in the wind like confetti. Not British pounds, not Icelandic krona, but Swedish kroner, a fortune in neutral currency blowing across a Scottish moor. The military arrived swiftly. A cordon was thrown around the site. The locals were told to leave. The bodies were recovered with solemn efficiency. The loose items, the papers, the money, the briefcase, were gathered up and disappeared into the pockets of intelligence officers. The narrative control began before the smoke had even cleared. The news broke the next morning. The Duke of Kent killed on active service. The shock was palpable. The king, at Balmoral, was shattered. He had lost his brother, his friend, and one of his few remaining links to sanity in a world gone mad. The funeral at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, was a tableau of raw grief. Princess Marina, the widow, was a figure of tragic majesty. Draped in heavy black mourning weeds, she looked like a Greek heroine from a classical tragedy. She did not weep politely into a handkerchief. She broke down. When she knelt by the open vault, her sobbing echoed off the stone fan vaulting, a sound so primal that it unnerved the stiff generals and politicians in the pews. It It was the sound of a woman who knew she had lost not just a husband, but a protector. George was laid to rest, but the questions were only just waking up. The Royal Air Force Court of Inquiry was convened with suspicious speed. It was held in secret. The findings were released almost immediately. A tragic accident due to an error of judgment by the captain of the aircraft. Pilot error. The classic wartime explanation. Blame the dead man who cannot defend himself. But the aviation community didn't buy it. A pilot of Frank Goyen's caliber does not simply forget where the mountains are. He does not fly a seaplane overland in fog unless he thinks he is somewhere else entirely, or unless he is forced to. The whispers began in the mess halls and the clubs. Why was the plane off course? Some suggested that George, pulling rank, had taken the controls. He was known to be an impatient pilot, overconfident. Had he tried to fly the plane himself, misjudged the drift, and driven them into the hill? It was a plausible theory, one that saved the RAF from embarrassment but stained the Duke's memory. The mystery passenger. When the bodies were counted, a disturbing anomaly emerged. There were 15 people on the flight manifest, but some reports from the recovery team suggested there was an extra body, a 16th man. Who was he? Why was he not on the list? Was he a spy? A German defector being spirited away? Or was it simply a grim miscounting of body parts in a catastrophic wreck? The official records were scrubbed clean of any mention of a 16th passenger, but the rumor persisted, fed by the silence of the survivor. Andrew Jack, the tail gunner, recovered from his injuries. He was the only man who knew what happened in those final minutes. He was the key, but the key was thrown away. He was visited by high-ranking officers and made to sign the Official Secrets Act. He was given a pension and told in no uncertain terms that the crash was a matter of state security. For the rest of his life, Jack refused to speak publicly about the crash, but to his family, in private moments, he maintained his delirious assertion it wasn't the pilot's fault. If it wasn't the pilot, and it wasn't the weather, then who? By 1942, the war was a meat grinder. Millions were dead. The outcome was far from certain. There were factions within the British establishment, aristocrats, royals, politicians, who believed that the war with Germany was a mistake, that the real enemy was Stalin and the Bolsheviks in the East. They wanted a negotiated peace. Prince George was the perfect emissary for such a group. He was royal, he had German cousins, and he had a history of bypassing protocol. The theory posits that the flight to Iceland was a cover. The real destination was Sweden. Neutral Sweden was the hub of international espionage, the place where enemies met in quiet rooms to talk. Was George carrying a proposal for a separate peace? Was the briefcase full of Swedish kroner intended to bribe officials or fund a covert operation? If this is true, it changes the crash from an accident to something far more sinister. It suggests that British intelligence, specifically the ruthlessly pragmatic Winston Churchill, found out about the mission. A rogue prince negotiating with the Nazis? It would have destroyed the Allied alliance. It would have been treason. Did Churchill order the plane to be sabotaged? Or did an agent on board interfere with the instruments? There is a chilling piece of evidence that supports the sabotage theory. The Sunderland W4026 was equipped with an IFF system. It was a secret device that broadcast a signal to British radar. After the crash, investigators found the IFF setting was wrong. It was set to a frequency that would have made the plane invisible or appear as an enemy to local radar. Was this accidental, or was it done to ensure that no one on the ground would warn them they were off course? There is also the matter of the alcohol. Some later reports claimed that a bottle of gin was found smashed in the cockpit. Was the crew drinking? Was the Duke drinking? Or was this a convenient detail planted to discredit the dead and support the pilot error recklessness narrative? As the war ground on, the crater on Eagle's Rock grew over with heather. The wreckage was picked clean by souvenir hunters. The official file was stamped top secret and buried in the archives. Prince George became a marble statue in a crypt, frozen in time. The crash on Eagle's Rock did not just scatter debris across the Scottish heather, it threatened to scatter the closely guarded secrets of the House of Windsor to the winds. While the public mourned the loss of a war hero, the machinery of the palace moved with silent, terrifying efficiency to contain the fallout. The death of Prince George was a tragedy, yes, but for the courtiers in gray suits who ran the monarchy, it was also a containment operation of the highest priority. The physical cleanup of the crash site was simple enough. The reputational cleanup was a far darker task. Almost immediately after the funeral, a figure emerged from the shadows to handle the Duke's private affairs. This man was Sir Anthony Blunt. To the world, Blunt was a distinguished art historian, the surveyor of the king's pictures, a man of impeccable taste and breeding, who had been a close friend of George during the bohemian days of the 1920s. But history would later reveal a shattering truth. Anthony Blunt was a Soviet spy, a member of the infamous Cambridge Five, a traitor working for the KGB in the heart of the British establishment. It is one of the great ironies of the 20th century that the man entrusted to sanitize the Duke of Kent's private life was himself living the ultimate double life. Blunt was dispatched to Coombe, George's country home, and to his apartments at Belgrave Square. His mission was unofficial but clear: locate and destroy anything that could embarrass the crown. He sifted through desks, unlocked private safes, and emptied drawers. He was looking for letters from men, letters from Kiki Preston, letters that hinted at drug use or the chaotic liaisons that had defined George's youth. What Blunt found and what he did with it remains a mystery. Did he burn them in the fireplace at Coombe, watching the ink of George's passionate, reckless scrawl turn to ash? Or did he, the master spy, keep some of them? Did he use them as leverage? We know that Blunt survived as a spy in the palace for decades before being unmasked. Perhaps the secrets of the dead prince were part of his insurance policy. The result, however, was a void. The personal voice of Prince George was effectively erased from the historical record. The archives were scrubbed clean, leaving behind only the dull official correspondence of a royal duke. While Blunt could burn letters, he could not unmake the children who were rumored to carry George's blood. For decades, whispers have persisted that George left behind more than just his 3 legitimate children with Marina. The most enduring and fascinating of these rumors concerns the queen of romance herself, the novelist Barbara Cartland. In the late 1920s, George and Cartland were close, very close. They moved in the same frantic, high society circles. In 1929, Cartland gave birth to a daughter, Rain. Rain McCorquodale grew up to be a force of nature, a socialite, a politician, and a woman of formidable will. But those who looked at her saw a haunting familiarity. She did not resemble her official father, Alexander McCorquodale. She had the heavy-lidded eyes, the distinct jawline, and the imperious, charismatic manner of the Windsors. She looked, quite simply, exactly like Prince George. There was also the shadow of America. Kiki Preston, the girl with the silver syringe, had also given birth to a child in 1926, at the height of her affair with George. The baby, a boy, was quietly adopted by the American publishing tycoon Cass Canfield. He was named Michael Canfield. Michael grew up in a world of privilege, unaware of his true parentage, though he bore a striking resemblance to the Duke of Kent. He moved in high circles, eventually marrying Lee Radziwill, the sister of Jackie Kennedy. Imagine the dinner parties. The son of the British king's brother married to the sister of the American president's wife. It was a secret alliance of dynasties that no one spoke of aloud. Michael Canfield struggled with alcoholism and depression throughout his life, the same Windsor curse that had plagued George. He died young, taking the secret of his paternity to the grave, another casualty of the collateral damage that royalty inflicts on those who get too close. While the ghosts of his past lived on in secret, his widow, Princess Marina, was forced to live out the consequences of his death in the harsh light of reality. The treatment of Marina by the royal family following George's death was nothing short of cold-blooded. She was a princess of Greece and Denmark by birth and a Duchess of Great Britain by marriage, yet she was left in a precarious financial position. The civil list, the government allowance given to royals, ceased upon George's death. There was no pension for a royal widow. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were sympathetic personally, but institutionally, the monarchy tightened its purse strings. Marina, the woman who had brought glamour and modernity to the family, was effectively told to fend for herself. It was a humiliation. In 1947, just 5 years after the crash, she was forced to hold a public auction of George's possessions at Christie's. The public watched in shock as the Merry Widow sold off the Duke's exquisite collection of English furniture, his porcelain, and his paintings. It was a fire sale of memories. Every gavel strike was a reminder of her reduced circumstances. Yet Marina bore it with a spine of steel. She refused to retreat into obscurity. She continued to perform her royal duties, often representing the Queen in emerging African nations or at tennis championships, always immaculately dressed, always smiling, always regal. She raised her children, Edward, Alexandra, and Michael, in a Kensington Palace apartment that was grand but frayed around the edges, teaching them that their dignity came from their conduct, not their bank balance. She became the keeper of the flame. She never remarried, though she was still young and beautiful. She dedicated the rest of her life to preserving the image of George as a hero, carefully editing the narrative, ensuring that her children knew the good father, not the troubled addict. It was her final act of love, a protective shield forged from silence and dignity. The death of Prince George was not just the end of a man, it was the closing of a door. It was the end of a specific type of royal possibility, the idea that a prince could be an individual, an artist, a free thinker. After George, the shutters came down. The monarchy retreated into dull respectability, terrified of another wild card. The life of Prince George serves as a haunting mirror to the institution that spawned him. He exposed the fundamental cruelty of the royal system. It demands that human beings be turned into symbols. It demands that a man with the soul of an artist and the desires of a bohemian crush himself into the shape of a naval officer and a duke. It was a suffocating mold, and George spent his entire life trying to break it. He fought with drugs. He fought with forbidden desire. He fought with speed and danger. He was the Icarus of the House of Windsor, flying on wax wings of his own making, desperate to feel the warmth of the sun. His tragedy is not just that he died young. His tragedy is that he was never really allowed to live. He was forced to hide his true self in the shadows, to speak in code, to love in secret. He was a man ahead of his time, or perhaps a man outside of time altogether. In the end, he didn't escape. He crashed into the hard reality of the world he tried to transcend. Today, if you walk through St. George's Chapel at Windsor, you will find his tomb. It is quiet there, smelling of stone and incense, but if you listen closely, you might hear the faint, syncopated rhythm of a jazz piano, a ghost note from a life played in a minor key. The rebel is sleeping, but his story, the story of the struggle between who we are and who we are told to be, remains as loud and as violent as the crash on the mountain.